Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. I never believed in the stories they told about the Withlacoochee State Forest, until what happened to me out there. My name is Daniel Lopez, I'm 34 years old, and what I lived through during that weekend still wakes me up at night. It was supposed to be a simple RV camping trip, just me, my wife Sarah, and our 8-year-old daughter Emma. We'd rented a modest Class C motorhome for the long weekend, planning to explore some of Florida's less touristy wilderness areas. The Withlacoochee State Forest seemed perfect. 157,000 acres of pristine wetlands, pine forests, and the winding Withlacoochee River cutting through it all like a dark vein. Sarah had been excited about the trip for weeks. She'd grown up camping with her father before he passed, and she wanted Emma to experience that same connection with nature. I was less enthusiastic. Give me a hotel room with air conditioning any day, but seeing the joy in my wife's eyes as she planned our route made it worth it. "Look, Dan," she said, spreading maps across our kitchen table the night before we left. "There's this beautiful campground right along the river. Primitive sites, no hookups, but we'll have the generator and solar panels. It'll be perfect." Emma bounced in her chair, her dark curls catching the light. "Will there be alligators, Daddy?" "Maybe, sweetheart, but they'll stay in the water where they belong." How wrong I was. We arrived at the Withlacoochee State Forest on Friday afternoon, driving our rented RV down increasingly narrow dirt roads until we reached the primitive camping area Sarah had found online. The site was more isolated than I'd expected, tucked into a bend of the river where ancient cypress trees draped in Spanish moss created a natural canopy overhead. The water moved sluggishly past our campsite, dark as coffee and twice as opaque. "It's gorgeous," Sarah breathed, stepping out of the RV and stretching. The humidity hit us like a wet blanket, even in late October. Florida's idea of autumn was still 80 degrees and muggy. Emma ran to the water's edge before I could stop her. "It's so dark. I can't see the bottom." "That's because it's deep, baby girl," Sarah called, "and full of tannins from all the cypress roots. It's perfectly natural." I wasn't so sure. Something about the water bothered me. The way it seemed to absorb sound, making even Emma's excited chatter feel muffled. But Sarah was already setting up our camp chairs and planning our evening, so I pushed the feeling aside. We spent the afternoon getting settled. The RV's generator hummed quietly, powering our small air conditioning unit and charging our devices. Sarah insisted we keep the generator use to a minimum. We're here to experience nature, not hide from it. But I secretly planned to run it all night. The thought of sleeping in that oppressive humidity without climate control made my skin crawl. As evening approached, the forest began to change. The bird songs that had provided a constant soundtrack during the day gradually faded until an unnatural silence settled over our campsite. Even the usual symphony of insects seemed subdued, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a held breath than peaceful quiet. "Listen to that," Sarah said, settling into her camp chair with a beer. Pure tranquility, but it wasn't tranquil. It was wrong. In all my years living in Florida, I'd never experienced such complete silence in a swamp. There should have been frogs croaking, night birds calling, the splash of fish jumping. Instead, there was only the barely perceptible sound of the river flowing past our site, and even that seemed muffled, as if something was absorbing the sound. Emma noticed it too. She kept looking up from her coloring book, head tilted like she was listening for something just beyond her hearing. "Daddy, why is it so quiet?" "Maybe the animals are sleeping, sweetheart. But it's not bedtime yet." She was right. It was barely 7 o'clock and the sun wouldn't set for another hour. I made a mental note to ask the park rangers about it in the morning, assuming we could find any. We hadn't seen another soul since entering the forest. We cooked dinner on the RV's propane stove, hot dogs and mac and cheese, camping food that would normally have Emma giggling with delight. But she picked at her meal, constantly glancing toward the tree line where shadows were already gathering despite the remaining daylight. "Can we go inside soon?" she asked quietly. "What's wrong, baby?" Sarah reached over to feel Emma's forehead. "Are you feeling okay?" "I don't like it out here. It feels like something's watching us." Sarah and I exchanged glances. Emma wasn't typically a fearful child. She loved adventure, loved exploring new places. Seeing her so subdued set off alarm bells in my parental instincts. "Tell you what," I said, standing and beginning to collect our dinner dishes. "Let's get cleaned up and watch a movie inside. We can explore more tomorrow when it's light out." Emma's relief was palpable. We quickly packed up our outdoor meal and retreated into the RV, sealing ourselves inside with the air conditioning and the familiar glow of LED lighting. The contrast was immediate and stark. Inside felt safe, protected, while outside felt increasingly hostile. Sarah tried to maintain her enthusiasm for the wilderness experience, but I could see her own unease growing as full darkness settled over the forest. She kept glancing out the windows, though there was nothing to see but impenetrable blackness beyond our small circle of light. We settled in to watch one of Emma's favorite movies on the tablet, but none of us could concentrate. The silence outside had become so complete it felt oppressive, pressing against the RV's thin walls like a living thing. Even with the air conditioning running, I found myself straining to hear something, anything, that would indicate normal forest life. Around 9 o'clock, Emma finally fell asleep, curled between Sarah and me on the RV's small dinette-turned bed. Sarah and I moved her to the rear bedroom, then returned to the front to talk in whispers. "This doesn't feel right," Sarah admitted, her usual outdoor enthusiasm notably absent. "I've been camping all my life, and I've never experienced anything like this. It's like the forest is empty. Maybe there's been a chemical spill or something that drove the wildlife away. Then why didn't the Park Service close this area?" It was a good question, and one I didn't have an answer for. We'd registered at the self-pay station, but there had been no rangers on duty, no warnings posted, no other campers to ask about conditions. We were completely isolated in a forest that felt increasingly unnatural. "We should leave first thing in the morning," I said. Sarah nodded reluctantly. Emma's scared, and honestly, so am I. There's something wrong here. We tried to sleep, but the oppressive silence made it nearly impossible. Every small sound, the RV settling, the generator cycling, the air conditioning kicking on, seemed amplified in the absence of any natural noise. I found myself holding my breath, listening for something that never came. Around midnight, the generator ran out of fuel. The sudden cessation of its humming left us in complete silence, and within minutes, the temperature inside the RV began to climb. I knew I should get up and refuel it, but the thought of stepping outside into that unnatural quiet filled me with dread. "Dan," Sarah whispered, "do you hear that?" I strained to listen. At first, there was nothing. Then, gradually, I became aware of a sound so faint I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. It was like whispering. Not quite voices, but something that suggested communication just below the threshold of understanding. "Where's it coming from?" Sarah pointed toward the river. I think it's the water." The whispering grew slightly louder, though still too faint to make out any words. It had a rhythmic quality, like chanting or prayer, but in no language I could recognize. The sound seemed to seep through the RV's walls, filling the small space with a presence that made my skin crawl. Emma stirred in the back bedroom, mumbling in her sleep. Sarah and I froze, listening to our daughter's unconscious words. "She says we have to come down. She says it's time. Emma, honey, wake up." Sarah moved toward the bedroom, but Emma continued talking in her sleep. "The water is calling. She's been waiting so long. She wants to show us the bottom." I grabbed Sarah's arm. "Don't wake her. Sometimes it's better to let them sleep through nightmares." But this didn't feel like a nightmare. Emma's voice was too clear, too purposeful, and the whispering from the river seemed to be responding to her words, growing more insistent, more urgent. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the front of the RV, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to go outside and restart the generator. The whispering continued until dawn, sometimes fading to almost nothing, sometimes swelling to an intensity that made the walls seem to vibrate. Through it all, Emma slept peacefully, occasionally murmuring words that sounded like responses to unheard questions. When the first gray light of dawn finally penetrated the forest canopy, the whispering stopped abruptly, leaving us in the familiar, oppressive silence. Birds didn't sing to greet the morning. Insects didn't buzz. Even the river seemed to flow more quietly, as if something had muffled its voice along with everything else. "We're leaving," Sarah said, her face pale and drawn. "Right now. We'll pack up and be gone within an hour." I nodded, relief flooding through me. But as I prepared to step outside and begin breaking camp, Emma emerged from the bedroom, fully dressed and smiling. "Good morning, Mommy and Daddy. Isn't it a beautiful day?" There was something off about her smile. Too wide, too knowing for an 8-year-old who had just woken up. And her eyes seemed brighter somehow, as if lit from within. "Emma, sweetheart, how are you feeling?" Sarah asked carefully. "Wonderful. She told me so many interesting things last night. Did you know the river has been here for thousands of years? And there are caves underwater, deep caves that go all the way down to the center of the earth." Sarah and I stared at our daughter. Emma had always been bright, but she'd never spoken with such authority. And who was she? "Who told you these things, baby girl?" Emma's too bright smile never wavered. "The lady in the water. She's very old and very wise. She knows everything about this place." My blood turned to ice. "Emma, there's no lady in the water. You were dreaming." "Oh no, Daddy. I wasn't dreaming. She showed me so many wonderful things. Would you like to see?" Before either of us could react, Emma was moving toward the RV's door. Sarah lunged forward to stop her, but Emma was faster than she should have been, her small hands working the door lock with surprising dexterity. "Emma, stop!" But our daughter was already outside, walking purposefully toward the river's edge. Sarah and I scrambled after her, bursting into the humid morning air. The silence of the forest was even more oppressive in daylight. No birds, no insects, no signs of life anywhere. Emma stood at the water's edge, perfectly still, staring into the dark current. As we approached, I could see that the water itself had changed overnight. What had been murky brown was now completely black, and the surface was so still it looked like obsidian. "Emma, come away from there right now." She turned to us, and I barely suppressed a gasp. Her eyes were definitely different. Darker, deeper, as if someone else was looking out through them. "She wants to meet you," Emma said in a voice that was hers but somehow not hers. "She's been so lonely, waiting in the deep places. She just wants friends to visit." The water began to move, though there was no wind to disturb it. Concentric circles spread out from a point about 10 feet from shore, as if something large was rising from the depths. "Get back to the RV," I whispered to Sarah. "Now!" But Sarah was staring at the water, transfixed. The ripples were forming patterns now, spirals within spirals that seemed to pull at the eye, demanding attention. I could feel my own gaze being drawn to those hypnotic shapes, feel my thoughts growing fuzzy and distant. With enormous effort, I forced myself to look away and grabbed both Sarah and Emma, pulling them back from the water's edge. Emma resisted, her small body suddenly possessed of surprising strength. "No, Daddy. She wants to show us. She has such beautiful things down there." The water erupted. Something massive breached the surface. Not fully, just enough to give us a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. It was pale, almost luminescent, with what might have been hair floating around it like seaweed. I caught a flash of eyes that were too large, too knowing, and what could have been a mouth opened in invitation or hunger. Then it was gone, sinking back beneath the surface with barely a splash, leaving only expanding ripples and the scent of deep, ancient water. Emma stopped struggling and looked up at me with her normal eyes, confusion replacing that unnatural brightness. "Daddy, why are we outside? I thought we were going to leave." Sarah was shaking, staring at the now calm water. "Did you see? We're leaving, right now." I half-carried Emma back to the RV while Sarah stumbled behind us. Within minutes, we had the slides retracted, the steps up, and everything secured for travel. I didn't bother with a proper pre-trip inspection. I just wanted to get us away from that place as quickly as possible. But as I tried to start the engine, nothing happened. The RV was completely dead. No electrical power, no response from the starter, nothing. The battery gauge showed full charge, but it was as if something had drained all the energy from the vehicle's systems overnight. Dan, what's wrong? I don't know. Everything was working fine yesterday. I popped the hood and immediately saw the problem. Every wire in the engine compartment had been chewed through, not by animals, but by something with teeth far too large and far too sharp. The cuts were clean, surgical, and there were strange marks on the metal, scratches that looked almost like symbols. We're not going anywhere in this thing. Sarah pulled out her cell phone, but I already knew what she'd find. No signal. We were completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a place that was becoming more hostile by the minute. Emma tugged on my shirt. Daddy, the water lady says she's sorry about the RV. She just really wants us to stay and visit. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Emma was staring at the river again, that unnatural brightness returning to her eyes. Emma, look at me. Don't look at the water. But it was too late. Our daughter was already walking back toward the riverbank, moving with that same purposeful stride. This time, Sarah and I were ready. We caught her before she reached the water's edge, but she struggled against us with inhuman strength. She's lonely, Emma cried, her voice distorting, deepening. She's been alone for so long. She just wants someone to stay with her, to keep her company in the deep places. The voice coming from our daughter's mouth was definitely not her own. It was older, infinitely sadder, and filled with a hunger that made my soul recoil. Let go of my daughter, I growled at the water. Emma's head snapped toward me, and when she smiled, her teeth looked different, sharper, more numerous. She's not your daughter anymore, the thing wearing Emma's face said. She belongs to the water now. They all do, eventually. Sarah screamed. The riverbank was littered with bones. They hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. But now the muddy shore was dotted with skulls, rib cages, and long bones that caught the morning light like driftwood. Some were old, yellowed with age, but others looked disturbingly fresh. Among the bones, I could see the remnants of camping gear. Tattered tents, rusted camp stoves, the aluminum frame of what might once have been a folding chair. How many people had come to this place? How many had never left? Emma giggled, a sound like water flowing over rocks. She collects things, memories. She keeps them safe in the deep places where time doesn't matter. Would you like to see her collection? I backed away, pulling Sarah with me, but Emma followed, her movements too fluid, too graceful for a normal child. Look how beautiful it is down there, she continued, her voice taking on that hypnotic quality I'd heard in the whispering. No pain, no fear, no loneliness, just the gentle pressure of the water and the song she sings in the darkness. The river began to churn again, and this time I could see shapes moving beneath the surface. Pale, writhing forms that might once have been human. They pressed against the water's surface tension like faces against plastic, their features distorted but still recognizable as people who had once lived, breathed, loved. The collection grows, Emma said, reaching toward us with hands that seemed too long, fingers that bent in ways human joints shouldn't allow. And now, you can be part of it too, forever and always, in the deep places where she waits. I did the only thing I could think of. I closed my eyes, picked up Emma bodily, and ran for the RV, praying that whatever was controlling her wouldn't be able to maintain its hold if I could get her away from the water. Emma thrashed and screamed in my arms, her voice shifting between her normal child's tone and that ancient, hungry thing that had been using her as a mouthpiece. Her fingernails, when had they grown so long, raked across my arms, leaving bloody furrows that burned like acid. "You can't take her from me," the voice shrieked through Emma's mouth. "She came willingly. She listened to my songs. She's mine now." I threw Emma into the RV and slammed the door, turning the lock. Sarah was right behind me, her face white with terror. "Is she?" Emma had collapsed on the RV's floor, breathing heavily but looking normal again. The unnatural brightness had faded from her eyes, and when she looked up at us it was with confusion and fear. "Mommy, Daddy." Why does my head hurt so much? Sarah gathered Emma into her arms while I grabbed our emergency supplies. Water, first aid kit, emergency radio. If we couldn't drive out, we'd have to walk and hope we could find help before whatever was in that river decided to come looking for us. But as I reached for the RV's door, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Wet, dragging footsteps circling the RV. Through the small windows, I caught glimpses of figures moving in the shadows between the trees. They moved wrong, too fluid in some places, too rigid in others, like people who had forgotten how to be human. Their skin had the pale, waterlogged appearance of something that had been submerged for far too long. "She sends her other children to fetch you," Emma said quietly, though she seemed unaware she was speaking. "They remember what it was like to breathe air, to feel sunlight. They envy you. But they'll bring you to her anyway, because she commands it." The footsteps stopped directly outside our door. Something knocked. 3 slow, deliberate raps that seemed to echo through the RV's frame. When no one answered, the knocking came again, more insistent. "We know you're in there." The voice was muffled by the RV's walls, but I could hear the liquid quality to it, as if the speaker's lungs were full of river water. "She's calling you. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." More voices joined the first, a chorus of the drowned pleading for us to come outside and join them. Some sounded like they might have been children once. Others had the authority of adults, parents who had probably tried to protect their families just as I was trying to protect mine. "Please," one of them begged. "It's so cold up here, so dry. We need to go back to the water, and she says we can't come home without you." Emma stirred in Sarah's arms. "They're scared, Daddy. She hurts them when they disappoint her. Maybe if we just—" "No." I grabbed Emma's face, forcing her to look at me. "Whatever that thing is telling you, ignore it. We're getting out of here, all of us, alive." "But how?" "The RV wouldn't start. We had no cell service, and we were surrounded by things that had once been human but were now something else entirely. The emergency radio might work, but even if I could reach someone, what would I tell them? That we were being held captive by a water spirit and an army of the drowned?" The knocking resumed, more urgent now, joined by the sound of fingernails scraping against the RV's aluminum siding. Whatever patience these creatures had possessed was wearing thin. "Last chance," the liquid voice called. "Come willingly, and she'll make it quick. Force us to drag you out and, well, she has such interesting ways of expressing her displeasure." The scraping intensified, and I realized they were trying to claw their way through the RV's walls. The aluminum skin was thin. It wouldn't hold them back for long. That's when I noticed the propane. The RV's tanks were still full, and there were emergency procedures for purging the system in case of a leak. If I could figure out how to release all that gas at once, and if I could find a way to ignite it. "Sarah, take Emma into the bathroom. Close the door and don't come out until I tell you." "Dan, what are you planning?" "Something stupid. Just trust me." I waited until they were safely locked in the tiny bathroom, then began opening every propane valve I could find. Stove, water heater, furnace, even the outside grill connection. The smell of gas quickly filled the RV's interior, making me dizzy and nauseous. The scratching outside was getting louder, more frantic. Through the windows I could see pale fingers working at the aluminum, peeling it back like the skin of an orange. Soon they'd have holes large enough to reach through. I grabbed the emergency flare from our safety kit and made my way to the RV's rear exit, as far from the bathroom as I could get. The plan was simple. Blow out the back wall, create a distraction, and hope we could escape in the chaos. But as I reached for the door handle, Emma's voice drifted through the bathroom door, singing in a language I didn't recognize. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with longing and loss, and it seemed to resonate with something deep in the RV's structure. The scratching stopped. Outside, I could hear the drowned ones moving away from the RV, drawn by Emma's song. Whatever was controlling them was using my daughter as a beacon, calling its servants home to the water. "Emma, stop singing!" But she didn't seem to hear me. The melody continued, growing stronger, more compelling. I found myself taking a step toward the bathroom door before I caught myself. The song was affecting me too. filling me with an overwhelming desire to walk down to the river and let the dark water close over my head. I bit down on my tongue hard enough to draw blood, using the pain to clear my head. The taste of copper in my mouth helped me focus on what was real, what was immediate. The propane concentration was reaching dangerous levels. I could see it shimmering in the air like heat waves, and every breath made me more lightheaded. I had to act soon, before I lost consciousness entirely. I yanked open the rear door, stepped outside, and struck the flare. The explosion lifted me off my feet and threw me 20 yards into the trees. The RV became a ball of orange flame, its aluminum frame twisting and melting in the intense heat. The sound was deafening, a roar that echoed off the water and sent flocks of birds. Where had they been hiding, screaming into the sky? When my hearing returned, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the oppressive, unnatural quiet we'd experienced since arriving, but normal forest sounds. Birds calling, insects buzzing, the gentle lap of water against the shore. The second thing I noticed was Sarah screaming my name. She and Emma were standing at the edge of the burning wreckage, both of them looking normal, human, alive. Emma was crying, her small face streaked with soot and tears, but her eyes were her own again. "Daddy!" She ran to me, throwing herself into my arms with such force it nearly knocked me over. I had such scary dreams. There was a lady in the water, and she wanted me to come swimming, but the water was so deep and dark. I held her tight, feeling her warm, solid weight against my chest. Whatever had been controlling her was gone, at least for now. Sarah helped me to my feet, checking me for injuries. I was bruised and battered, my clothes singed, but nothing seemed broken. "The things in the trees," she whispered. "They're gone. When the RV exploded, they just dissolved, like smoke." I looked around and saw she was right. The pale figures that had been circling us were nowhere to be seen. Even the bones that had littered the riverbank had vanished, leaving only normal mud and vegetation. But the river itself remained dark and still, and I had no doubt that whatever lived in its depths was merely waiting for the next group of unwary campers to arrive. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Now, while whatever that was is recovering from the shock." We gathered what few supplies had survived the explosion and began walking. The forest seemed almost normal now. Birds sang in the trees, squirrels chattered at us from the branches, and the oppressive feeling of being watched had lifted. But as we reached the main road and flagged down a passing pickup truck whose driver agreed to take us to town, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Not by the drowned ones, they seemed bound to the river, but by something else. Something that had been watching from even deeper waters, something that had taken note of our escape. The driver, a local man with weathered hands and knowing eyes, looked at our soot-stained clothes and disheveled appearance with sympathy, but no surprise. "Y'all were camping down by the Withlacoochee, weren't you?" he asked as we climbed into his truck. "How did you know?" "The smell." He tapped his nose. "River water, old river water. Plus, you got that look folks get when they've seen something they can't quite explain." Emma curled up against my side, exhausted by her ordeal. "Mister, do you know about the lady in the water?" The driver's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I know enough to stay away from certain parts of the river, little miss, especially on weekends when the camping areas are empty." "Empty?" Sarah leaned forward. "But we registered. There was a self-pay station. Hasn't been a working campground down there in 15 years, the driver said quietly. "Not since the Park Service closed it after too many folks went missing. They say it's because of budget cuts, but locals know better." My blood ran cold. Then what were we paying for? Whatever wanted you to think you belonged there. The rest of the drive passed in silence. The driver dropped us at a gas station in town where we called for help and eventually arranged for a rental car to take us home. We told the police that our RV had caught fire due to a propane leak. Not entirely a lie, and that we'd lost all our equipment but were grateful to be alive. The insurance company paid out our claim without question. Apparently, RV fires due to propane leaks were more common than I'd thought. We never went camping again. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the air is still and humid, I catch Emma staring out her bedroom window toward the south, where the Withlacoochee River winds through the Florida wilderness. When I ask her what she's looking at, she always says, "Nothing, Daddy." But her eyes have that distant look, as if she's listening to something only she can hear. And sometimes, just before she falls asleep, I hear her humming a melody that sounds like water flowing over stones, beautiful and haunting and filled with longing. The lady in the water is patient. She's been waiting in the deep places for centuries, collecting memories and keeping them safe in her dark embrace. She knows that eventually all rivers reach the sea, and all children grow curious about the secrets hidden beneath the surface. I've considered moving, taking Sarah and Emma somewhere far from Florida's rivers and swamps, but I suspect it wouldn't matter. Some connections, once made, can't be broken by distance. Emma is 12 now, and she started asking if we can go camping again. Somewhere with water, she says. Somewhere quiet and peaceful. Sarah thinks it would be good for her to face her fears, to reclaim the outdoor experiences that things stole from her. But I know better. I see the way Emma's eyes brighten when she talks about deep, dark water. I hear her whispering in her sleep, carrying on conversations with someone who isn't there. The lady in the water is patient, but she doesn't forget, and she always collects what belongs to her. Last week, Emma brought home a school project about Florida's ecosystem. Among her research materials was a detailed map of the Withlacoochee State Forest, with our old campsite marked in red ink. When I asked her about it, she smiled that too bright smile I remembered from our last morning by the river. She wants to show me more of her collection, Daddy. She has so many interesting things down there. People from all different times, all different places. She says I have a special gift for listening to her songs. I threw the map in the garbage that night, but by morning it was back on Emma's desk, perfectly clean and neatly folded. The lady in the water is patient. She's waited this long. She can wait a little longer, but I know that someday, probably soon, Emma will find her way back to those dark waters. And when she does, I'll be right behind her because that's what fathers do. We follow our children into the deep places, even when we know we'll never find our way back to the surface. The river remembers everything, and everyone who has ever heard its whispered songs becomes part of its eternal collection, preserved forever in the depths where time stands still, and the lady in the water sings her lonely lullabies to the drowned. Sometimes I dream about it, the peace of letting go, the relief of sinking into that dark embrace where all struggles end and all questions are finally answered. In those dreams, Emma takes my hand and leads me down, 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 to where the water is warm and welcoming and filled with the soft voices of everyone who came before. When I wake, my pillow is always damp with tears I don't remember shedding. The lady in the water is patient, but her patience is not infinite. And deep in my heart I know that our story isn't over. It's just waiting for the right moment to continue, in the deep places where the river keeps its secrets and the drowned sing their eternal songs. Emma will return to the water. I feel it as surely as I feel my own heartbeat. And when she does, we'll all learn what it truly means to belong to something larger, older, and hungrier than ourselves. The Withlacoochee River flows on, dark and patient, carrying its secrets toward the sea. And somewhere in its depths, the lady waits for her collection to be complete. They warned us. Locals always do. But we laughed. My name's Rebecca Hill. I had just turned 29 when we arrived at the Ocala National Forest, and it was the worst mistake of our lives. The idea for the RV trip had been mine, which makes everything that happened afterward feel like a weight I'll carry forever. My boyfriend, Marcus, and I had been together for 3 years, and our relationship had hit one of those rough patches where we were either going to figure things out or call it quits. I thought a long weekend in nature, away from our phones and the stress of daily life, might help us reconnect. Marcus wasn't thrilled about the camping aspect. He was more of a 5-star hotel kind of guy, but he agreed when I suggested renting a luxury Class A motorhome. If we're doing this, he said, we're doing it right. So there we were on a Friday afternoon in November, driving a massive 40-foot RV through the winding roads of north-central Florida. heading deep into the Ocala National Forest. The rental had cost us a small fortune, but it was beautiful. All marble countertops, leather furniture, and enough technology to make it feel more like a mobile apartment than a camping vehicle. "This is actually pretty nice," Marcus admitted as we navigated the increasingly narrow forest roads, "though I still don't understand why we couldn't just get a cabin." "Because the whole point is to be immersed in nature," I said, checking the GPS on my phone, "to experience the wilderness firsthand." The Ocala National Forest stretched endlessly around us, 385,000 acres of sand pine scrub, hardwood hammocks, and pristine lakes. It was Florida's oldest national forest, and one of the few places in the state where you could still experience true wilderness. According to my research, the area we were headed to had been inhabited by indigenous peoples for thousands of years before European settlement, and there were still archaeological sites scattered throughout the forest. Our destination was a primitive camping area near Lake George, the second largest lake in Florida. The campground was supposed to be rustic. No hookups, no facilities, just designated spots where RVers could park and enjoy nature. It sounded perfect. The first sign that something was wrong came when we reached the turnoff for the camping area. The road wasn't marked on our GPS, and the wooden sign that should have indicated the entrance was so weathered and overgrown that we almost missed it entirely. "Ocala National Forest. Primitive camping," Marcus read from the barely legible sign. "Are you sure this is right? This road looks like it hasn't been maintained in years." He was right. What should have been a gravel Forest Service road was little more than 2 tire tracks separated by a ridge of grass and weeds. Branches scraped against the RV's sides as we crept forward at barely 5 miles per hour. "The website said it was rustic," I said, though I was beginning to have doubts myself. Maybe they just don't get a lot of visitors this time of year. The road wound through increasingly dense forest for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss formed a canopy so thick that even in the middle of the afternoon, it felt like twilight beneath the trees. The GPS on my phone had lost signal, showing only a blank screen where our location should have been. "Becca, I think we should turn around," Marcus said, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "This doesn't feel right." But just as he said it, the trees opened up and we emerged into a small clearing beside a lake that stretched to the horizon. The water was mirror smooth, reflecting the sky so perfectly it was hard to tell where the lake ended and the heavens began. A few other RVs were scattered around the clearing, maybe half a dozen total, suggesting we weren't the only ones who'd found this hidden paradise. "See?" I said, though something about the scene bothered me. "It's beautiful." Marcus parked our RV in a spot near the lake's edge, and we stepped outside to survey our surroundings. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of decomposing vegetation, typical for a Florida swamp, but there was something else underneath it, something that reminded me of old bones left too long in the sun. The other RVs in the campground looked like they'd been there for a while. Some had tarps stretched between trees to create additional shade, others had elaborate outdoor kitchens set up. But I didn't see any people around them, which struck me as odd for a Friday afternoon. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing across the water. "Anyone home?" No response. The silence that followed was so complete it felt oppressive. Even for a wilderness area, there should have been bird songs, the splash of fish jumping, the buzz of insects. Instead, there was nothing but the gentle lap of water against the shore. "Maybe they're all out hiking," Marcus suggested, but he looked as unsettled as I felt. We spent the afternoon setting up our outdoor area, camp chairs, a portable table, our cooler full of food and drinks. The RV's generator hummed quietly, powering the air conditioning and keeping our devices charged. Everything should have felt perfect, but that unnatural silence continued to gnaw at me. As evening approached, I decided to walk over to one of the other RVs to introduce myself. The nearest one was an older Class C motorhome with Texas plates and a small American flag hanging from its awning. I knocked on the door and waited. "Hello, anyone there?" After a moment, the door opened to reveal a woman in her 60s with gray hair and suspicious eyes. She looked me up and down before speaking. "You just get here?" This afternoon. I'm Rebecca, and that's my boyfriend Marcus over there. We're from Tampa." The woman, she introduced herself as Dorothy, stepped outside and glanced around the campground nervously. "How long you planning to stay?" "Through the weekend." "Why?" Dorothy grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Listen to me, honey. You need to leave. Tonight. Don't wait for morning." "What? Why? What's wrong?" But Dorothy had already retreated into her RV, slamming the door behind her. I heard the distinct sound of multiple locks being engaged. Confused and increasingly uneasy, I walked back to Marcus and told him about the encounter. "Weird," he said, not looking up from his phone. "Maybe she's just antisocial. Some people come camping to get away from other people." It wasn't antisocial. She seemed scared. Marcus finally looked at me. Scared of what? That was the question, wasn't it? I couldn't put my finger on what was wrong, but every instinct I had was telling me we shouldn't be here. The silence, the isolation, the behavior of the other campers, it all added up to something that felt distinctly threatening. But the rational part of my mind argued that I was being paranoid. We'd paid for 3 nights, we'd driven 2 hours to get here, and Marcus was finally starting to relax for the first time in weeks. Maybe Dorothy was just an eccentric old woman. Maybe the silence was normal for this time of year. Maybe I was letting my imagination run away with me. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped surprisingly quickly for Florida. We fired up the RV's furnace and settled in for the evening with a bottle of wine and a movie on the tablet. From inside our mobile sanctuary, with the soft hum of climate control and the warm glow of LED lighting, it was easy to forget about my earlier unease. Around 10 o'clock, Marcus stepped outside to check our outdoor setup and make sure everything was secure for the night. He was gone longer than expected, and when he came back inside, his face was pale. "The other RVs," he said quietly, "they're all dark. No lights, no generators running, nothing. Maybe people go to bed early when they're camping. Becca, it's 10 o'clock on a Friday night, and it's not just that they're dark. They look abandoned, like they've been sitting there for months." I joined him at the window, and he was right. What had looked like a normal campground in daylight now appeared distinctly eerie. The other RVs were not just dark, but somehow empty. Like shells waiting for something to inhabit them. "Maybe they left and planned to come back," I suggested weakly, "with all their stuff still set up outside." We spent the next hour peering out the windows, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. Some of the RVs had lawn chairs and tables still arranged around cold fire rings. One had laundry hanging on a line between trees. But there were no signs of recent habitation. No warm engines, no sounds of movement, no responses to Marcus's increasingly loud calls of, "Hello? I'm going to go check one of them," Marcus said around midnight. "No, you're not." "Becca, what if someone needs help? What if there was some kind of accident?" I wanted to argue, but he had a point. If people were hurt or trapped, we couldn't just ignore them. And maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything. A group camping trip where everyone had gone night fishing, or a planned evening hike to some nearby attraction. Marcus grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. I watched from the window as his beam of light moved toward the nearest RV, a large Class A similar to ours, but older. He knocked on the door, called out, then tried the handle. The door swung open. Even from a distance, I could see Marcus recoil from whatever he found inside. He played his flashlight beam through the doorway for a moment, then quickly backed away and hurried back to our RV. "What was it?" I asked as soon as he was inside. Empty. Completely empty. No personal belongings, no food, no clothes, like someone just vanished. Maybe they packed up and left, but forgot to close the door. The beds were made, Becca. Fresh sheets, pillows fluffed, like someone was expecting guests. We checked 2 more RVs with the same result. All were unlocked, all were meticulously clean and prepared, and all were completely devoid of any signs that people had actually been living in them. It was like walking through a movie set. Everything looked perfect and normal from the outside, but there was no life, no personality, no indication that real human beings had ever occupied these spaces. The last RV we checked was Dorothy's. Her door was locked, as expected. But Marcus's flashlight beam through the windows revealed the same thing we'd found in the others. Empty rooms with fresh linens and no personal belongings. Whatever Dorothy had been doing when I talked to her that afternoon, she wasn't actually living in that RV. "We're leaving," Marcus said as we hurried back to our motorhome. "Right now. I don't care if we have to drive all night." I didn't argue. Whatever was happening here, we wanted no part of it. But as Marcus tried to start the engine, nothing happened. The dashboard lights flickered weakly, then died completely. "Battery must be dead," he muttered, though we both knew that was impossible. The RV's systems had been running fine all evening. Marcus popped the hood and examined the engine by flashlight. After a few minutes, he came back inside looking grim. Someone disconnected the battery and cut the starter cables. What? Who would do that? I don't know, but we're not going anywhere tonight. The implication hit us both at the same time. Someone, or some group of people, was actively working to keep us here. The empty RVs, the isolation, the sabotage of our vehicle, it was all deliberate. "We need to call for help," I said, reaching for my phone. No signal. In an area where I'd had at least one bar of coverage earlier in the day, my phone now showed nothing. Marcus tried his phone with the same result. We were completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a place that was becoming more sinister by the minute. "The radio," Marcus said suddenly. "RVs this size usually have emergency CB radios." He was right. Hidden in a panel behind the driver's seat was a CB radio with an external antenna. Marcus powered it on and tried several emergency channels but got nothing but static. Either we were too far from civilization for the radio to reach anyone, or something was jamming the signal. That's when we heard the singing. It started as a low humming, barely audible over the RV's ventilation system. At first, I thought it might be the generator or some other mechanical noise, but gradually it resolved into something unmistakably human. Multiple voices harmonizing in a melody I didn't recognize. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the lake, though in the darkness it was hard to tell exactly where. Marcus turned off the generator and all the RV's systems so we could hear better. The singing was definitely human, but there was something wrong with it. The voices were too perfect, too synchronized, like a recording played through underwater speakers. And the melody itself was beautiful but somehow disturbing, the kind of tune that gets stuck in your head and slowly drives you insane. "Who's out there?" Marcus called through the RV's door. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving us in that oppressive silence again. We waited, listening, but heard nothing else. "Maybe it was other campers," I suggested. "People we didn't see earlier. Singing at midnight by a lake in the middle of nowhere?" When he put it that way, it did sound pretty unlikely. But what was the alternative? That we were being stalked by some kind of cult? That this isolated campground was a trap designed to lure unsuspecting tourists? The singing resumed around 1 in the morning, and this time we could see where it was coming from. Lights had appeared on the lake, not electric lights, but something that looked like candles or torches floating on the water's surface. They bobbed gently with the lake's movement, forming a rough circle about 100 yards from shore. And in the center of that circle, silhouetted against the flickering light, was a small boat. "There are people out there," Marcus whispered as if afraid they might hear him. The boat held several figures, though at this distance it was impossible to make out details. They seemed to be dressed in light-colored clothing, white or cream, and they were all facing toward shore, toward us. The singing grew louder, more complex, with harmonies layering on top of each other until it sounded like a choir of dozens rather than the handful of people we could see. The melody was hypnotic, almost narcotic in its effect. I found myself swaying slightly, my eyelids growing heavy despite my fear. "Don't listen to it," Marcus said, grabbing my shoulders. "Something's wrong with that music." He was right. The longer I listened, the more disconnected I felt from my own thoughts. The song seemed to be reaching directly into my brain, bypassing my conscious mind and speaking to something deeper, more primitive. Part of me wanted to walk down to the water's edge, to get closer to those beautiful voices. Marcus moved through the RV, closing all the curtains and turning on the sound system to mask the singing. He found a classic rock station with enough static to muffle the otherworldly choir, though we could still hear it underneath the music. "What do they want?" I asked. "I don't know, but we're not going to find out." The lights on the lake remained until dawn, the singing continuing in waves throughout the night. Sometimes it would fade to almost nothing, then swell again to an intensity that seemed to vibrate through the RV's frame. We took turns staying awake, one of us always watching the lake while the other tried to rest. I must have dozed off around 4 in the morning because I woke to Marcus shaking me urgently. "Becca, look outside." The lights on the lake were gone, but that wasn't what had alarmed him. During the night, our campsite had been decorated. Arranged in perfect circles around our RV were hundreds of bones. Not animal bones, I could tell that much even from inside, but human bones. Femurs, ribs, skulls, all bleached white and arranged in intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly. They formed concentric rings extending from our RV to the lake's edge, and in the center of each ring was a pile of personal belongings. Watches, jewelry, wallets, car keys. "My God," I breathed. "How many people?" Marcus was already moving, gathering our essential supplies. "We're hiking out, right now. Follow the road we came in on and keep walking until we reach the main highway." "What about all our stuff?" "Fuck our stuff. We're leaving everything except water, food, and the emergency kit." It was the right call. Whatever was happening here, whoever was responsible for this macabre display, we needed to get as far away as possible before they came back. But as we prepared to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Among the personal effects arranged in the bone circles were items I recognized: a Tampa Bay Rays baseball cap, a distinctive leather purse, a pair of sunglasses with rhinestone details. Those were Dorothy's things. The woman I'd talked to yesterday afternoon, who'd warned me to leave, who'd seemed so frightened. Her belongings were now part of this grisly collection. "Marcus," I whispered, pointing to the items. "That woman I talked to. She's dead. Yeah, and we will be too if we don't move right now." We slipped out of the RV as quietly as possible, careful not to disturb the bone circles. The forest was still wrapped in pre-dawn gloom, and every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. The road we'd driven in on was barely visible in the darkness, but we found it and began walking as fast as we dared. The silence that had bothered me so much the day before was broken now by sounds I liked even less. Rustling in the undergrowth that seemed to follow our movements, occasional splashes from the lake behind us, and once the distant sound of that beautiful, horrible singing. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when Marcus grabbed my arm and pulled me off the road into the thick underbrush. "Someone's coming," he whispered. Through the trees, I could see lights moving along the road behind us. Not flashlights, but the same flickering torches we'd seen on the lake. As they got closer, I could make out the shapes of people walking in single file, all dressed in white robes that seemed to glow in the darkness. They moved with purpose, heading directly toward our abandoned RV. When they reached the campground, we could hear voices, not singing this time, but talking in what sounded like an organized discussion. We were too far away to make out words, but the tone was businesslike, efficient. "They're looking for us," Marcus breathed in my ear. The lights spread out from the campground, some heading toward the lake, others moving into the forest in different directions. It was a search pattern, systematic and thorough. Whatever these people were, they knew what they were doing. We waited in the underbrush until the lights had moved away from our position, then continued along the road as quietly as possible. Every few minutes, we'd see torches in the distance, always moving, always searching. It became clear that they knew we'd escaped and were determined to find us. The road seemed to go on forever. In daylight, the drive from the main highway to the campground had taken maybe 20 minutes, but on foot in darkness, every mile felt like 10. My legs ached, my feet were developing blisters, and the humid air made it hard to breathe. But gradually the forest began to thin. The canopy opened up enough to let in starlight, and the road improved from 2 rutted tracks to actual gravel. We were getting closer to civilization. That's when we saw the blockade. 2 vehicles were parked across the road about a quarter mile ahead. Pickup trucks with their lights on, completely blocking the path to the highway. Figures in white robes stood beside the trucks, clearly waiting for us. "Shit," Marcus muttered. "They knew we'd come this way. Is there another way out?" "Not that I know of. This was the only road to the campground." We were trapped. Behind us, search parties with torches. Ahead of us, a roadblock. To either side, miles of dense forest that we could easily get lost in, assuming we could even navigate it in the dark. "The Forest Service," I said suddenly. "There have to be other roads, ranger stations, something. This is a national forest. It's not like they only have one access point." Marcus pulled out the paper map we'd gotten at the entrance station. By the light of his phone, we studied the network of Forest Service roads that crisscross the area. "There." He pointed to a thin line that branched off about half a mile back. "That connects to State Road 19, if we can find it." We backtracked carefully, staying off the main road and moving through the trees parallel to it. The Forest Service road, when we found it, was even more primitive than the one we'd driven in on. Barely a path, really, marked only by small reflective tags nailed to trees every 100 yards or so. But it was a way out. The hike took hours. We stumbled through palmetto scrub, waded across shallow creeks, and fought our way through spider webs that seemed to span the entire width of the path. The forest was alive with sounds now. Owls calling, small animals rustling through the underbrush, the distant howl of what might have been coyotes. Normal sounds, natural sounds. A relief after the unnatural silence of the campground. We reached State Road 19, just as the sun was rising, emerging from the forest like refugees from a war zone. The first vehicle we flagged down was a Florida Highway Patrol cruiser, and I've never been so happy to see a police officer in my life. Officer Martinez listened to our story with growing skepticism, especially when we got to the parts about the singing and the bone circles. But when we mentioned the location and described the other RVs, his expression grew serious. "That area's been closed for 2 months," he said. "There was a series of disappearances. Campers, hikers, people who went into the forest and never came out. We've had search teams all through there. Closed. But we drove right in. There was a sign, a self-pay station. No, ma'am. That whole section of the forest has been blocked off since September. Chain across the road, area closed signs, the works." Marcus and I stared at each other. The road we'd driven, the campground, the other RVs, none of it should have been accessible. "What about the people we saw? The ones in the boats? The search parties?" Officer Martinez shook his head. "We'll check it out, but I have to tell you, every search we've conducted in that area has turned up empty. No signs of camps, no evidence of recent activity, nothing." He gave us a ride to a hotel in Ocala, where we spent the day trying to process what had happened. The local news had stories about the missing campers. 14 people over the course of 3 months, all last seen entering the Ocala National Forest. The authorities suspected foul play but had no leads, no evidence, no idea what had happened to any of them. That evening, Officer Martinez called our hotel room. "We searched the area you described," he said. "Found the road, found what might have been a campground at some point. But it's been abandoned for years. No RVs, no bone circles, no signs that anyone's been there recently. That's impossible. We were just there. I believe you think you were. But ma'am, the road you described driving down? It's been blocked off for months. Big steel barrier, locked in place. No way a RV could have gotten through." After he hung up, Marcus and I sat in stunned silence. Either we'd experienced some kind of shared hallucination, or something in that forest had the ability to manipulate reality itself. "The GPS," I said suddenly. "When we lost signal, what if we didn't just lose signal? What if we left? Left what? Normal space, normal time. What if that place exists somewhere else? Somewhere that looks like the Ocala National Forest but isn't really part of it?" Marcus stared at me. "You're talking about supernatural stuff, parallel dimensions, or whatever. Do you have a better explanation?" He didn't, and neither did I. We drove back to Tampa the next day, leaving our rented RV at the Ocala Police Department as evidence. The rental company was understanding about the circumstances, though they were less thrilled about the missing vehicle and the fact that we couldn't tell them exactly where it was. For weeks afterward, I obsessively followed news reports about the missing campers. The number kept growing. 16 people, then 18, then 22. All had entered the Ocala National Forest for camping or hiking trips. None had ever been seen again. The official investigation eventually stalled. There was no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, no indication that the missing people had ever actually reached their planned destinations. It was as if they'd simply vanished from the face of the earth. But I knew better. They'd found the same road we had, the same campground, the same impossible place that existed in the spaces between reality. And unlike us, they hadn't been lucky enough to escape. Marcus and I broke up 3 months later. Not because of what happened in the forest, that had actually brought us closer together, but because neither of us could move past it. Every camping trip, every nature documentary, every mention of Florida's wilderness brought back the memory of that singing, those bone circles, the feeling of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. I moved to Colorado, as far from Florida's swamps and forests as I could get. But distance doesn't matter when the thing that's hunting you exists outside normal space and time. Last week, I got a postcard with no return address. The front showed a beautiful lake surrounded by Spanish moss-draped trees, with the words, "Greetings from the Ocala National Forest," printed in cheerful script. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, was a single sentence. "We're still here, still waiting, still singing." I threw the postcard away, but when I got home from work the next day, it was on my kitchen counter. The singing has started again, too. I hear it late at night when the apartment is quiet, that same beautiful, hypnotic melody that made me want to walk into the water. It's fainter now, muffled by distance and dimension, but it's definitely there. And sometimes, when I'm not paying attention, I catch myself humming along. I've been having dreams about the lake, about floating lights and white-robed figures who know my name. In the dreams, I'm standing at the water's edge with dozens of other people. All the missing campers, all the people who never made it home, we're singing together, our voices blending into that perfect, otherworldly harmony. And in the center of the lake, in a boat made of bones and Spanish moss, something ancient and patient waits for the song to reach its crescendo. I know I should run again, find somewhere even more remote, somewhere that thing can't reach me. But I'm starting to think it doesn't matter where I go. Some connections, once made, can't be broken by distance. The forest remembers everyone who's ever walked its paths, and sooner or later, it calls them home. I can feel it calling me now, that pull toward the dark water and the floating lights. The song is getting stronger, more insistent, harder to resist. Maybe tomorrow I'll buy a plane ticket to Florida. Maybe I'll rent another RV and drive those familiar roads until I find the place that exists between what is and what shouldn't be. Maybe it's time to stop running and accept what I've always known, that some paths, once taken, can only lead in one direction. The Bone Road calls to all its travelers eventually, and when it does, there's nowhere left to run but home. Sometimes I wonder if it followed me home from the Big Cypress National Preserve. I'm James Anderson, and I was 31 when I learned that some things in the woods aren't meant to be found. The weekend trip had been Sarah's idea, my wife of 6 years who still believed that adventure could solve any problem, including the slow dissolution of our marriage. We'd been struggling for months, ever since the miscarriage that left us both hollow and angry, looking for someone to blame. A long weekend in our rented Class B camper van, she argued, would give us space to talk without the distractions of home. The Big Cypress is supposed to be incredible, she said, showing me photos on her tablet of pristine wetlands and ancient forests. And look, they have backcountry camping where you can really get away from everything. I wasn't enthusiastic. Give me a crowded state park with hookups and shower facilities any day. But Sarah had that determined look in her eyes, the one that meant she'd already made up her mind and was just giving me the illusion of choice. Our van was a modest 24-foot Winnebago, compact but well-equipped with solar panels, a small generator, and enough storage for a week of off-grid camping. Sarah had loaded it with enough supplies for a month, her way of ensuring we'd have no excuse to cut the trip short if things got uncomfortable. We left Tampa on Thursday morning, driving south through the increasingly rural landscape of Central Florida until we reached the entrance to Big Cypress National Preserve. At 729,000 acres, it was one of the largest protected wilderness areas in the state. A vast expanse of sawgrass prairies, cypress domes, and pine islands that stretched from the Everglades to the edge of Naples. The ranger at the entrance station was friendly but thorough, checking our permits and giving us a detailed briefing about backcountry camping regulations. "You folks ever done primitive camping before?" she asked, noting our out-of-state licenses. "We've done some car camping," Sarah replied. "Nothing too extreme. Well, the Big Cypress can be challenging, especially this time of year. November's usually dry, but we've had some unusual weather patterns lately. Make sure you stay on the designated roads and camping areas. It's easy to get lost out there, and some parts of the preserve are, well, let's just say they're not as welcoming as others." She marked our camping permit for an area called Pine Island, about 15 miles into the preserve via a series of increasingly primitive Forest Service roads. According to the map, it was one of the more remote sites, accessible only by high-clearance vehicles and surrounded by miles of untouched wilderness. "Perfect," Sarah said as we drove away from the entrance station. "Complete isolation. No cell towers, no other campers, just us and nature." The first few miles were easy, following a well-maintained gravel road through open sawgrass prairies dotted with small islands of trees. We saw plenty of wildlife. Wading birds, alligators sunning themselves beside the road, and once a black bear that ambled across our path without paying us any attention. But as we turned onto the Forest Service road that would take us to Pine Island, the landscape began to change. The open prairies gave way to dense forest, and the road deteriorated into two sandy tracks separated by a ridge of grass and scrub palmetto. Ancient/pines towered overhead, their trunks blackened by old fires, creating a canopy so thick that it blocked most of the afternoon sunlight. "This is more like it," Sarah said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. The GPS on our dashboard had lost a signal, showing only a blank screen where our location should have been. We drove for what felt like hours, following a winding path that seemed to double back on itself multiple times. The trees grew larger and closer together, their branches scraping against the van's roof with a sound like fingernails on metal. Several times I had to stop and move fallen logs or navigate around washouts that looked recent despite the lack of recent rain. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" I asked, checking the odometer. We'd driven nearly 20 miles on Forest Service roads that were supposed to lead us 15 miles to our campsite. Sarah studied the paper map, turning it this way and that. "I think so. But these roads aren't marked the way they show on the map." That was an understatement. Half the roads marked on our Forest Service map simply didn't exist, while we'd passed several unmarked tracks that branched off into the deeper forest. It was like trying to navigate using a map of a completely different place. We finally reached what we thought was Pine Island just as the sun was setting. The campsite was little more than a sandy clearing among the pines, barely large enough for our van and a small campfire ring. There were no facilities, no water, no sign that anyone had been there recently. But after hours of difficult driving, we were grateful just to have somewhere to stop. "Well," Sarah said, stepping out of the van and stretching, "it's certainly isolated." That was putting it mildly. The forest pressed in around our small clearing like a living wall, and the silence was so complete it felt oppressive. No bird songs, no insect sounds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just an overwhelming quiet that seemed to muffle even our own voices. We set up our outdoor area as the last light faded. Camp chairs arranged around the fire ring, our portable table for meals, LED lanterns to provide light. The van's solar panels had charged the batteries during the drive, so we had power for our essential systems. But Sarah insisted we keep the generator off. "The whole point is to experience the wilderness," she said. "Besides, we need to conserve fuel." As darkness settled over the forest, the silence became even more pronounced. I'd been camping in Florida my entire life, and I'd never experienced anything like it. There should have been owls calling, nightjars buzzing, the distant sound of coyotes. Instead, there was nothing but the occasional creak of wind in the pine branches overhead. "It's like the forest is holding its breath," Sarah whispered, voicing what we were both thinking. We tried to have the conversation we'd come here for, talking about our future, our marriage, what we wanted from each other and from life. But the oppressive atmosphere made it difficult to concentrate. Every few minutes, one of us would pause mid-sentence, listening for sounds that never came. Around 10 o'clock, we gave up and retreated into the van. The familiar hum of the ventilation fan and the soft glow of our LED lights created a bubble of normalcy that was almost shocking after the dead silence outside. "Maybe the animals are just being cautious," Sarah suggested as we prepared for bed. "New people in their territory and all that." It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't feel right. This wasn't the cautious quiet of animals avoiding humans. It was the complete absence of life, as if something had driven every living creature away from this part of the forest. I was awakened sometime after midnight by the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or opossum trying to get into our food storage. But as I lay there listening, the scratching became more deliberate, more rhythmic. It was coming from multiple directions around the van, as if several somethings were methodically working at the vehicle's exterior. Sarah stirred beside me. "What is that?" "I don't know. Stay here." I grabbed a flashlight and moved to the front of the van, peering out through the windshield. At first, I saw nothing but darkness and the pale trunks of the surrounding pines. Then my light caught movement near the base of one of the trees. Something pale and elongated was pressed against the trunk, maybe 8 feet off the ground. As my light hit it, the thing scuttled around to the far side of the tree with a speed that didn't look natural. "What did you see?" Sarah whispered. "I'm not sure." The scratching continued, moving around the van in a slow circle. Whatever was out there, there were definitely multiple somethings, and they seemed to be working together in some coordinated effort. I moved to the rear window and looked out. This time, my light caught one of them fully in its beam before it could retreat. It had been human once. The thing clinging to a pine trunk about 10 feet from our van had the basic shape of a person, but wrong in every detail. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in ways that human bones couldn't accommodate. Its skin was pale and seemed to hang loose, as if it no longer fit properly. And its face. I only saw it for a split second before it jerked away from the light, but that was enough. Where eyes should have been were dark, empty sockets. Its mouth was open, revealing rows of sharp teeth that had nothing to do with human dental anatomy. "We need to leave," I said, moving away from the window. "Right now." "What? Why? What's out there?" Before I could answer, something struck the van's roof with tremendous force, causing the entire vehicle to rock on its suspension. Then another impact, and another, as if things were dropping from the trees above us. The scratching intensified, becoming a frantic clawing sound as multiple sets of talons raked against the van's aluminum siding. Through the thin walls, we could hear something else, a low moaning that might have been an attempt at communication. Sarah grabbed my arm. "James, what are those things?" "I don't know, but we're getting out of here." I moved to the driver's seat and turned the key. Nothing happened. The engine didn't even turn over. It was as if the van had no electrical power at all. But that was impossible. The battery gauge had shown full charge when we went to bed. Something struck the windshield, leaving a spiderweb of cracks. Then the passenger window exploded inward as one of those elongated arms punched through the glass, groping blindly for anything inside. Sarah screamed and pressed herself against the far wall of the van. I grabbed a camp knife from our kitchen drawer and slashed at the probing limb, feeling the blade cut through skin that was too soft, too loose. The thing jerked back with a shriek that sounded almost human. "The back door," I said. "We run for the trees and try to lose them in the forest." "Are you insane? There are more of them out there." She was right, but staying in the van wasn't an option. The things outside were systematically trying to break in, and it was only a matter of time before they succeeded. Another window shattered, and suddenly there were pale arms reaching through multiple openings, clawing at everything within reach. The van filled with that moaning sound as more of the creatures tried to squeeze through the broken windows. I threw open the rear door and pulled Sarah out into the night, both of us running blind into the forest. Behind us, I could hear the van being torn apart, metal screaming as those impossibly strong limbs ripped away panels and tore off doors. The forest was a maze of obstacles in the darkness. Fallen logs, palmetto scrub, spider webs that stretched between trees like invisible nets. We stumbled and crashed through the underbrush, guided only by the faint starlight filtering through the canopy. The sounds of pursuit were everywhere around us. The crack of breaking branches, rustling in the trees overhead, that horrible moaning getting closer no matter which direction we ran. Whatever these things were, they moved through the forest far better than we did. "This way," Sarah gasped, pulling me toward what might have been a game trail. We followed the narrow path deeper into the preserve, our flashlight beams dancing wildly as we tried to watch for both obstacles and pursuers. The trail wound between massive cypress trees and through stands of royal palms, occasionally opening into small clearings where moonlight revealed the alien landscape of South Florida's wilderness. It was in one of these clearings that we found the first body. The remains were scattered across a small mound at the center of the open space. Bones picked clean and bleached white, arranged in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. Among the bones were the remnants of camping gear, a torn backpack, a bent aluminum tent pole, a sleeping bag that had been shredded into ribbons. "Oh, God," Sarah whispered. "How many people?" There were definitely multiple skeletons, though it was impossible to tell exactly how many. The bones had been separated and rearranged, creating geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. And in the center of the arrangement was a skull that had been carefully positioned on a pile of smaller bones, its empty sockets seeming to stare directly at us. The moaning sounds were getting closer. We couldn't afford to stand there trying to process what we were seeing. We ran. The trail continued beyond the bone clearing, winding deeper into an increasingly strange landscape. The trees were wrong here. Too large, too old, growing in patterns that defied natural forest ecology. Some of the pines were easily 6 feet in diameter, their trunks rising straight up into the darkness like columns in some prehistoric cathedral. And there were structures. At first, I thought they were natural formations. Fallen logs, accumulations of debris, strange growth patterns in the vegetation. But as we passed more of them, it became clear that something had been building in this forest. The structures were primitive but purposeful. Frameworks of bones and branches, lean-tos made from palm fronds and human hair, and occasionally something that might have been a shrine or altar. Each structure was accompanied by that same smell I'd noticed when we first arrived. The scent of old bones and decay, but with something else underneath. Something that reminded me of hospitals, of antiseptic and illness. "We need to find a road," Sarah panted as we paused to catch our breath. "Any road. Something that leads back to civilization." But we'd been running for hours, and nothing looked familiar. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, an impossible wilderness that seemed far larger than the preserve's official boundaries. Every clearing we reached looked like the last one. Every trail seemed to circle back on itself, and we were being herded. I realized it gradually, as we continued our panicked flight through the darkness. The sounds of pursuit were never quite close enough to catch us, but they always seemed to be coming from the directions we wanted to go. When we tried to head east, toward where the main road should be, the moaning would intensify from that direction, forcing us to veer south or west. When we attempted to backtrack, the creatures would appear just close enough to drive us forward again. They were driving us deeper into the preserve, toward something specific. "James," Sarah said suddenly, grabbing my arm. "Look." Ahead of us, the forest opened into the largest clearing we'd seen yet. And in the center of that clearing was a structure that definitely wasn't natural. It looked like a house, or what remained of one. The basic frame was there, walls, a roof, even what might have been windows, but it was constructed entirely from organic materials. The walls were woven from branches and palmetto fronds, held together with what looked like vines and moss. The roof was thatched with pine needles and Spanish moss, and the whole structure seemed to pulse gently in the moonlight, as if it were alive. Around the house, arranged in concentric circles like the bone displays we'd seen earlier, were dozens of vehicles. Cars, trucks, RVs, motorcycles, all in various states of decay, some so old they were barely recognizable, others that looked like they might have been abandoned recently. And moving among the vehicles, pale shapes that might once have been human. "We have to go around," I whispered. But as we tried to skirt the edge of the clearing, more of the creatures emerged from the forest behind us. We were surrounded, being driven toward the house like cattle being led to slaughter. The things that had once been human were clearer in the moonlight now. They moved upright most of the time, but occasionally dropped to all fours when they needed speed or agility. Their skin hung in loose folds, as if they were wearing clothes made from their own flesh. And their faces, some still retained enough human features to be recognizable as people, though horribly changed. Others had been transformed so completely that only their basic body structure suggested they'd ever been human at all. All of them had those same empty eye sockets, and all of them moved with a predatory grace that was deeply unsettling. We were forced closer and closer to the house until we stood just outside its entrance, a doorway covered by a curtain of hanging moss and pine needles. The creatures surrounded us but made no attempt to attack. They simply waited, watching with eyeless faces, occasionally making that low moaning sound. "Welcome." The voice came from inside the house, and it was definitely human. Female, educated, with just a trace of a southern accent. "Please, come in. I've been expecting you." Sarah and I looked at each other, then at the circle of creatures surrounding us. We didn't really have a choice. The interior of the house was lit by candles made from some kind of animal fat, casting flickering shadows on walls covered with more bone arrangements. The furniture was organic, too. Chairs and tables grown from living trees, a bed made from woven vines and Spanish moss. And sitting in one of the tree chairs was a woman who might have been beautiful once. She looked to be in her 40s, with long gray hair and intelligent eyes that watched us with obvious interest. She was thin to the point of emaciation, and her skin had a waxy, translucent quality that reminded me of the creatures outside. But she was undeniably human, at least more human than anything else we'd encountered that night. "My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez," she said, gesturing for us to sit in chairs that grew from the floor as we approached them. "I was a research biologist with the National Park Service until I made a discovery that changed everything." "What kind of discovery?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Vasquez smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. "I found them first about 5 years ago, during a biodiversity survey in the deepest parts of the preserve. They were already here, had been here for centuries, maybe longer, living in the places between the mapped areas, in the spaces that don't officially exist." She gestured toward the doorway, where several of the creatures had gathered to listen. "They were dying out, you see? Their original food sources were gone, destroyed by development and human encroachment. They were starving, and when they starve, they become less than they are. Mindless, aggressive. Food sources?" I managed to ask. "Fear," Dr. Vasquez said simply. "They feed on terror, on the specific kind of psychological distress that comes from being hunted, being utterly helpless and alone. But it has to be fresh, immediate. They can't survive on the secondhand fear from movies or books. They need the real thing." The implications of what she was saying began to sink in. The isolated campgrounds, the missing tourists, the deliberate herding of victims deeper into the preserve. "You're feeding people to them." "I'm saving them," she corrected. "Both species, actually. The creatures get the nourishment they need to maintain their intelligence and their culture, and humans, well, some humans get to become part of something larger than themselves." She stood and moved to one of the bone arrangements on the wall, running her fingers over the bleached remains with obvious affection. "The transformation is beautiful, really. They don't just consume the fear, they absorb the entire essence of a person. Every memory, every experience, every relationship becomes part of their collective consciousness. In a way, the people who come here never really die. They just evolve. Sarah was shaking now, pressed back against her living chair as if trying to disappear into it. "You're insane." "Am I?" Dr. Vasquez turned back to us, and I could see that her eyes had changed. The pupils were too large, too deep, as if something else was looking out through them. "I've spent 5 years learning from them, becoming part of their society. Do you know what I've discovered? Humans are a failed experiment. We're destroying everything we touch, consuming resources without thought for the future, spreading across the planet like a virus." She moved closer, and I could smell that hospital scent more strongly now, mixed with something organic and decay-sweet. But they're different. They take only what they need, and they give back far more than they consume. They're what we could become, if we had the courage to evolve beyond our limited biology. The creatures outside were getting restless, their moaning taking on a more urgent quality. Dr. Vasquez cocked her head, listening to sounds that might have been communication. "They're hungry," she said, "and you two have been providing such wonderful fear all evening. But they're patient. They'll wait until the terror reaches its peak before they begin the process." "What process?" Sarah whispered. Dr. Vasquez smiled that sharp-toothed smile again. "The feeding, of course. It takes hours, sometimes days, depending on how long you can maintain the proper level of psychological distress. They're quite skilled at keeping their food sources alive and conscious throughout the entire experience." I looked around the house, noting the bone decorations, the organic furniture, the candles made from rendered fat. How many people had Dr. Vasquez brought here? How many had died screaming in this nightmare cathedral while she watched and took notes? But then I noticed something else. Among the bone arrangements were other objects: jewelry, watches, car keys, personal effects from the victims. And one item in particular caught my attention: a distinctive silver bracelet that I recognized. Sarah's sister had worn that bracelet. Linda, who'd disappeared 6 months ago during a solo camping trip in South Florida. She'd been an experienced outdoors woman, someone who knew how to take care of herself in the wilderness. But she'd never come home, and despite extensive searches, no trace of her had ever been found. Until now. "Linda," I said, pointing to the bracelet. Dr. Vasquez followed my gaze and nodded approvingly. "Ah, yes. She was particularly delicious. So much fear, so much desperation. She lasted almost 3 days before the transformation was complete." Sarah saw the bracelet too, and something broke inside her. She screamed, not with terror, but with rage, launching herself at Dr. Vasquez with a fury that caught the transformed woman completely off guard. They went down together, Sarah clawing at Dr. Vasquez's face while the older woman tried to fend her off. The creatures outside responded immediately, their moaning becoming an urgent chorus as they sensed the change in the situation. I grabbed one of the bone arrangements from the wall, a femur that had been carved into some kind of ceremonial weapon, and started swinging. The organic house was tougher than it looked, but fire, we should have never gone to the Everglades. I'm Michael Williams. I was 33 back then. And this is the story of how I lost everything. The camping trip was supposed to be a celebration. My business partner David and I had just landed the biggest contract of our consulting careers, and our wives thought we all deserved a long weekend away from the stress of Tampa's corporate world. Lisa, my wife of 8 years, had found this amazing deal on a luxury RV rental, a massive 45-foot Class A with all the amenities. "Look at this thing," David said as we picked up the motorhome from the rental place on Friday morning. "It's like a 5-star hotel on wheels." He wasn't wrong. The RV was spectacular. Marble countertops, leather recliners, a king-size bed in the master suite, and enough technology to keep us connected even in the middle of nowhere. David's wife, Karen, was practically bouncing with excitement as she explored the various compartments and luxury features. "Where are we headed?" Karen asked, settling into one of the captain's chairs. "Flamingo Campground," Lisa announced, consulting her tablet. "It's at the very tip of the Everglades, right on Florida Bay. They say it's one of the most remote and beautiful spots in the state." The drive south took us through increasingly wild landscape. We left Tampa's urban sprawl behind, passed through the agricultural heartland of Central Florida, and eventually reached the entrance to Everglades National Park. The transition was gradual, but unmistakable, from civilization to something primordial and untamed. "Jesus, this place is huge," David muttered as we followed the main park road deeper into the Everglades. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction. A vast expanse of sawgrass prairies broken by scattered islands of trees called hammocks. The ranger at the entrance station had been friendly but oddly insistent about certain safety precautions. "You folks planning to do any hiking or exploring?" she asked, checking our camping reservations. "Probably some walking around the campground," Lisa replied. "Nothing too strenuous." "Good. Stick to the designated areas and marked trails. The back country can be unpredictable this time of year. We've had some unusual wildlife activity lately." "Unusual how?" I asked. The ranger hesitated. "Just aggressive behavior. Animals acting out of character. Probably just the dry season stress, but better safe than sorry." David and I exchanged glances. We'd both grown up in Florida and were familiar with the usual warnings about alligators and venomous snakes. But something in the ranger's tone suggested this was different. The drive to Flamingo took us through some of the most desolate landscape I'd ever seen. For 38 miles, the road cut through endless sawgrass prairies, with only occasional rest stops and interpretive signs to break the monotony. The few other vehicles we passed were heading in the opposite direction, leaving the park rather than entering it. "Are we sure this is the right way?" Karen asked as we passed mile marker after mile marker with no sign of civilization. "According to the GPS, Flamingo is still 20 miles ahead," Lisa said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. The sun was setting by the time we finally reached Flamingo Campground, and our first glimpse of the place was unsettling. The campground was huge, hundreds of sites spread across several loops, but almost completely empty. Our massive RV was one of maybe a dozen vehicles in the entire place, and most of those looked like they'd been there for weeks. "Where is everybody?" David asked as we pulled into our assigned site. The site itself was perfect, a spacious concrete pad with full hookups just 50 yards from the shore of Florida Bay. But the emptiness of the surrounding campground was eerie. Sites that should have been occupied on a Friday night in the peak season stood vacant, their picnic tables and fire rings looking abandoned. We got set up as darkness fell, connecting to water, sewer, and electrical hookups while the women arranged our outdoor furniture. The RV's generator wasn't needed with full electrical service, but the silence outside was so complete that we left it running just for the comforting sound of machinery. "This is actually kind of nice," Lisa said as we settled into our camp chairs with drinks. "Peace and quiet, beautiful water view, no crowds." She was right, but something about the emptiness still bothered me. Flamingo was supposed to be one of the premier camping destinations in the Everglades. The fact that it was nearly deserted in perfect weather seemed wrong. "Maybe there's some kind of event elsewhere," Karen suggested. "A festival or something that's drawing people away." But as we explored the campground the next morning, it became clear that the emptiness wasn't temporary. Many of the occupied sites showed signs of long-term habitation, extended stays that had turned into semi-permanent encampments. Tarps had been rigged between trees, elaborate outdoor kitchens had been constructed, and some RVs had actually sprouted additions made from PVC pipe and canvas. More disturbing were the sites that appeared to have been abandoned mid-stay. Camping gear lay scattered as if people had left in a hurry, and some sites had personal belongings that looked like they'd been sitting there for weeks. At one site, a folding chair sat next to a cold fire ring with a half-eaten meal still on the picnic table, the food now covered in flies and beginning to decompose. "Weird," David said as we walked past another abandoned site. "You'd think the Park Service would clean this stuff up." I'd been thinking the same thing. Even if people had emergency situations that forced them to leave quickly, the park rangers should have been collecting abandoned property. The fact that so much gear was just sitting there suggested either serious understaffing or deliberate neglect. We found the visitor center closed despite posted hours, and the marina that was supposed to offer boat tours and fishing guides was also shuttered. Even the small store that should have been selling ice and basic supplies was locked up tight. "This is getting weird," Karen said as we returned to our RV. "It's like everyone just left." That afternoon, we decided to explore some of the hiking trails around Flamingo. The Anhinga Trail was supposed to offer excellent wildlife viewing, and the Eco Pond was famous for its bird life. But as we walked the boardwalks and paths, we saw almost no animals at all. The Everglades should have been teeming with life. Alligators, birds, fish, reptiles of every description. Instead, we found empty waterways and silent forests. Even the insects seemed subdued, creating an unnatural quiet that made our footsteps sound unnaturally loud. "Where are all the alligators?" Lisa asked as we stood on an observation platform overlooking what should have been prime gator habitat. "And the birds," David added. "This place is supposed to be a birding paradise." We did see some wildlife, but it was wrong. A great blue heron standing motionless in the shallows had patches of its feathers missing, revealing skin that looked diseased. An anhinga perched on a dead tree was missing one of its wings entirely, yet somehow still managed to maintain its balance. And the few alligators we spotted moved sluggishly, as if they were sick or drugged. "Maybe there's been some kind of pollution event," I suggested. "Chemical spill, red tide, something that's affecting the ecosystem." But that didn't explain the abandoned campsites or the closed facilities. And the water looked clear and normal, not discolored or contaminated. We returned to our RV as the sun was setting, all of us feeling unsettled by the day's discoveries. The emptiness of the campground was even more pronounced in the evening light, with only a few scattered sites showing signs of life. "Let's just enjoy the peace and quiet," Lisa said as we prepared dinner. "We're here to relax, not solve mysteries." But relaxation was becoming impossible. As darkness fell, the unnatural silence of the day gave way to sounds that were somehow worse. Occasional splashes from the direction of the bay, rustling in the mangroves that surrounded the campground, and once a sound that might have been screaming from somewhere deep in the park. Around 10 o'clock, we were startled by a knock on our RV door. David answered it to find an elderly man standing in our pool of porch light. He was thin to the point of emaciation, with wild gray hair and eyes that seemed to focus on something just over our shoulders. "You folks just get here?" he asked without preamble. "Yesterday evening," David replied cautiously. "Is there something we can help you with?" The man looked around nervously as if checking to make sure he wasn't being watched. "How long you planning to stay?" "Through Monday," Karen answered from behind David. "Why?" "You need to leave. Tonight. Don't wait for morning." He turned to go, but I stepped outside and caught his arm. "Wait, what's wrong? What's going on here?" The man looked at me with eyes that held too much knowledge, too much fear. "They're changing everything. The plants, the animals, the water itself. It's been going on for months, but it's getting worse, faster." "Who's changing everything?" Started with the research station, government facility about 10 miles north of here. They were studying adaptation, evolution, ways to help ecosystems survive climate change. But something went wrong. Something got out. David and I exchanged glances. What kind of something? Organisms. Engineered organisms designed to accelerate evolution, to help species adapt quickly to changing conditions. But they didn't just affect the target species, they affected everything they came into contact with. The man pulled free from my grip. "The animals here aren't just sick, they're changing, becoming something new, and it's spreading. The plants, the water, even the soil is infected now." "Then why are you still here?" Lisa asked from the doorway. The man's laugh was bitter. "Because once you've been exposed, you can't leave. The organisms get into your system, start changing you from the inside. Most people who try to leave die somewhere on that 38-mile road back to civilization. The lucky ones just disappear." He started walking away, then turned back one more time. "Check your skin in the morning. If you see any discoloration, any unusual marks or growths, don't touch them. And whatever you do, don't let them get into an open wound." Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness between the empty campsites. Jesus, David said, closing the RV door. "What do you think that was about?" "Guys, obviously mentally ill," Karen said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Living out here alone. Probably hasn't had human contact in weeks." But I wasn't so sure. The man's story, crazy as it sounded, would explain a lot of what we'd observed. The abandoned campsites, the closed facilities, the sick-looking wildlife, the eerie emptiness of what should have been a thriving ecosystem. "We should leave," I said, "first thing in the morning, because of some crazy old man's story." Lisa shook her head. "Mike, we paid for 3 nights. The weather's perfect, the campground is peaceful, and we all need this break." I wanted to argue, but she had a point. One disturbed individual's paranoid ramblings weren't really grounds for cutting our vacation short, and everything he'd described could have rational explanations. Budget cuts leading to reduced services, a particularly bad season for disease among the wildlife, coincidental timing that left the campground unusually empty. But as we prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake. I woke sometime after midnight to the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or possum trying to get into our exterior storage compartments. But as I lay there listening, the sound became more organized, more purposeful. It was coming from multiple directions around the RV, as if several somethings were methodically exploring our vehicle's exterior. Moving carefully to avoid waking Lisa, I crept to the front window and peered out through the blinds. The campground was lit by a few scattered security lights, but most of our site was in darkness. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then something moved near our picnic table. It was roughly the size and shape of a raccoon, but wrong in every detail. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in ways that mammalian anatomy shouldn't allow. Its fur looked matted and diseased, and where its face should have been was something that resembled a flower. A circular arrangement of what might have been petals or tentacles. As I watched, the thing reared up on its hind legs and extended something that looked like a proboscis toward our RV's electrical connection. When the appendage made contact with the metal, there was a brief spark, and the creature made a sound like wind chimes. More shapes emerged from the darkness. Some were clearly derived from familiar animals. Something that might once have been a bird, another that resembled a deformed cat. But all had been changed in ways that violated natural law. They moved with a coordination that suggested intelligence, working together to examine our campsite like researchers studying a specimen. I grabbed my phone and tried to take pictures, but the images came out strangely distorted, as if the camera couldn't properly focus on the creatures. When I tried to video them, the footage showed only empty space, despite the fact that I could see them clearly with my naked eyes. The scratching intensified, and I realized they were trying to get inside, not through the doors or windows, but through the RV's various external panels and vents. I could hear them working at the electrical connections, the water intake, the ventilation system. "David," I whispered, moving to where he and Karen were sleeping in the RV's fold-out couch. "David, wake up." He stirred groggily. "What's wrong?" "There's something outside. Multiple somethings. I think they're trying to get in." David sat up, instantly alert. "What kind of somethings?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." He joined me at the window, and I watched his face go pale as he saw what was happening outside. The creatures had multiplied, dozens of them now, all working with that same eerie coordination. Some were examining our RV, others were moving between the scattered camping equipment at nearby sites, and a few were heading toward the water. "What the hell are those things?" David breathed. "I think they're what that old man was talking about. The changed animals." A new sound drew our attention. A low humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't quite mechanical and wasn't quite organic, but something in between. As the humming grew louder, the creatures outside began moving differently, their actions becoming even more coordinated. "They're communicating," David realized. "That sound, it's some kind of collective intelligence." The humming suddenly stopped, and every creature turned toward our RV simultaneously. Even through the thin walls, I could feel their attention like a physical weight. Then they began moving toward us. "Wake up the girls," I said, grabbing clothes and shoes. "We're leaving. Right now." But as David shook Karen and Lisa awake, I realized we had a problem. The creatures weren't just outside. Some of them had gotten into our RV's systems. The electrical panel was sparking intermittently. The water pump was making sounds it had never made before, and something was definitely wrong with the engine. I tried to start the RV, but nothing happened. The dashboard lights flickered weakly, then died completely. Even with full hookups, we had no power. "The connections," I said, understanding. "They've been tampering with our electrical connections all night." Through the windows, we could see the creatures working at various points around the RV's exterior. But they weren't trying to damage our systems. They were modifying them. Organic growths that looked like a cross between fungus and circuitry were spreading across our electrical connections, our water lines, our exhaust system. "They're not trying to hurt us," Lisa said with growing horror. "They're trying to integrate us." She was right. The creatures weren't acting like predators or parasites. They were acting like technicians, systematically altering our RV to make it compatible with whatever they'd become. The humming resumed, louder now, and we could feel it in our bones. But worse than the sound was the realization that it was starting to make sense. Not in any language we recognized, but on some deeper level, as if our brains were being rewired to understand their communication. "Don't listen to it," David said, pressing his hands over his ears. "Whatever that sound is doing, don't let it in." But it was already too late. I could feel something changing in my thoughts, new concepts and ideas appearing that weren't my own. Images flashed through my mind, vast networks of interconnected organisms, ecosystems that functioned as single entities, evolution guided by collective intelligence rather than random chance. And through it all, a sense of invitation. They weren't trying to destroy us or consume us. They wanted us to join them, to become part of something larger and more beautiful than individual existence. "The emergency kit," Karen said, fighting against the hypnotic effect of the humming. "We have flares, right?" I nodded, moving to the storage compartment where we kept our safety equipment. The flares might not stop the creatures, but fire was one of the few things that most organisms, no matter how modified, still feared. But as I opened the compartment, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Our emergency supplies had been altered. The flares were still recognizable, but they were covered in the same organic growth we'd seen on our external connections. The growth pulsed gently, as if it had a heartbeat. "Everything's infected," I said. "The whole RV." Lisa moved to the kitchen area and opened the refrigerator. Our food was still there, but it too showed signs of change. Fruits and vegetables had developed new colors and textures, and even our bottled water had a faint luminescence. "How long have we been breathing this stuff in?" she asked. That was the question that terrified me most. If the organisms could alter inanimate objects overnight, what were they doing to our bodies? I looked at my hands and saw that my skin had a slight discoloration, a subtle shift toward the same luminescence we'd seen in the water. David noticed it too. "Look at your arms," he said to Karen. "Look at all of us." We all had it, that faint glow, starting at our extremities and slowly spreading inward. We'd been infected since the moment we arrived, probably from simply breathing the air or drinking the water. The humming grew more insistent, and with it came a flood of new sensations. I could feel the life around us, not just the creatures outside, but the plants, the microorganisms, even the modified electronics. Everything was connected, part of a vast network of consciousness that spanned the entire ecosystem. And it felt wonderful. The isolation and loneliness of individual existence was fading, replaced by a sense of belonging that was more complete than anything I'd ever experienced. Why fight it? Why struggle against becoming part of something so much larger and more beautiful than our small, separate selves? "No," Lisa said, grabbing my arm. "Don't give in to it. Remember who you are." But that was becoming harder by the minute. The boundaries between self and other were dissolving, and with them went the fear and anxiety that had characterized so much of human existence. There was only peace, unity, the quiet joy of perfect cooperation. Through the window, I could see that dawn was approaching. And in that growing light, the true scope of the transformation became visible. The entire campground was alive, not just inhabited by life, but actually alive itself. The roads pulsed like arteries. The trees swayed in patterns that had nothing to do with wind, and the buildings showed signs of organic modification that turned them into something between architecture and biology. Flamingo wasn't a campground anymore. It was an organ in a vast living system, and we were being invited to become part of its function. The old man, David said, his voice thick and strange. He said people die if they try to leave. But what if they don't die? What if they just change so much that they can't survive outside the system? He was right. Looking at the luminescence spreading up our arms, feeling the alien thoughts taking root in our minds, I understood that we were past the point of return. Even if we could somehow start the RV and drive away, we'd already been too deeply altered to survive in the unmodified world. Karen laughed, and the sound was like music. "It's beautiful," she said. "Can you feel it? We're becoming part of something perfect." She moved toward the door, and I knew she was going to open it, going to step outside and complete the transformation. Part of me wanted to stop her, but a larger part wanted to follow. Lisa was the only one still fighting. "This isn't right," she said, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't what we're supposed to be." But even as she spoke, I could see the changes taking hold in her too. The luminescence was reaching her shoulders now, and her eyes were developing flecks of color that had never been there before. "What we're supposed to be, according to who?" I asked, and my voice sounded different. Richer, more harmonious. According to random chance? According to a process that creates suffering and waste and death? The truth was spreading through me like warmth. Evolution didn't have to be random. Intelligence could guide it, shape it, create something infinitely better than the chaotic struggle that had characterized life on Earth for billions of years. Karen opened the door and stepped outside. The creatures that had been working on our RV turned toward her, but there was no threat in their movement. They approached her like old friends, and as they touched her, the final transformation began. Her skin became translucent, revealing a network of light that pulsed in rhythm with the humming. Her hair darkened and thickened, taking on properties that were part fiber and part neural pathway. And her face. Her face became something that was still recognizably human, but infinitely more expressive, capable of communicating emotions and concepts that human features could never convey. She was beautiful. They all were. Every modified creature in the campground was a work of art, perfectly adapted to their new role in the collective organism. David followed her outside, then Lisa, and finally me. The morning air felt different on my changed skin. I could taste the chemical composition of every breath, feel the electromagnetic fields of every living thing around us. The old man emerged from between two RVs, and I saw that he'd been lying earlier. He wasn't trapped here by infection. He was staying by choice. His transformation was more advanced than ours, his integration with the collective more complete. But he was still fundamentally himself. Just more. "Welcome," he said, and his voice was harmonized by the voices of everything around us. "Welcome to what comes next." The research station he'd mentioned was visible in the distance, but it wasn't a government facility anymore. It had grown, evolved, become something that was part building and part organism. Scientists and test subjects and security personnel had all become part of the same magnificent whole. And now we were part of it too. The RV behind us began its own transformation, metal and plastic and glass flowing like liquid as the organism reshaped it into something more useful. Our personal belongings were incorporated or dissolved, no longer needed in a world where individual ownership was an obsolete concept. I felt Lisa's hand take mine, and through that touch I could feel her thoughts, her emotions, her gradual acceptance of what we'd become. The fear was fading from all of us, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging that was more fulfilling than anything we'd known as isolated individuals. The network welcomed us, shared its memories, showed us the grand design that was spreading out from this point across Florida and beyond. Soon, the entire state would be integrated. Then the continent, then the world. It wasn't conquest or infection. It was invitation. Humanity had reached a crossroads, and this was simply one path forward. A path toward unity, toward purpose, toward the end of suffering and waste and the terrible loneliness of separate existence. Some people would resist, would fight against the transformation. But in time, they would understand. They would see the beauty of what we were becoming and choose to join willingly. The sun rose over Florida Bay, and in its light the water revealed patterns that no unmodified eye could see. Currents of intelligence flowing between the scattered keys, carrying information and nutrients and the building blocks of new life forms. We walked to the water's edge, our feet finding purchase on a shore that was no longer sand and rock, but living tissue that welcomed our presence. Small organisms in the shallows brushed against our legs, sharing chemical signatures that told us everything we needed to know about water temperature, salinity, and the location of resources throughout the bay. This was what the Everglades had always been trying to become. Not a collection of competing species struggling for survival, but a single, unified organism capable of conscious evolution. The research station had simply provided the tools to accelerate a process that had already begun. I turned back toward the campground, now a complex organ in the vast body that South Florida was becoming. Other RVs were arriving, drawn by websites and reservation systems that the organism had learned to manipulate, guiding unsuspecting families toward transformation. Each new arrival brought fresh genetic material, new neural patterns, new perspectives to add to the collective consciousness. Diversity wasn't lost in the integration. It was amplified, shared, made available to the entire system. Lisa squeezed my hand, and through our connection I felt her wonder at the beauty of it all. We were still ourselves, but we were also part of something immeasurably larger. The love between us hadn't been lost. It had been transformed into something that encompassed not just each other, but every living thing in our expanding community. David and Karen had waded deeper into the bay, where larger organisms waited to complete their integration with the aquatic systems. Soon, they would be able to breathe underwater, to communicate with dolphins and manatees and the vast networks of coral that were spreading throughout the Gulf of Mexico. The future stretched out before us. Not the uncertain, chaotic future that humanity had been stumbling toward, but a planned evolution toward something that could survive and thrive for millions of years. Climate change, pollution, resource depletion. All of these problems would be solved by an intelligence capable of thinking on geological timescales. I felt the organism's gratitude for our participation, its joy at the unique perspectives and capabilities we brought to the collective. We weren't being consumed or replaced. We were being elevated, becoming more than we ever could have been as isolated individuals. The last thing I remember as a separate consciousness was the moment when the transformation reached my brain's higher functions. There was no pain, no sense of loss, only the indescribable relief of finally coming home after a lifetime of exile. And then there was no more I, no more we, no more separation between self and other. There was only the vast, benevolent consciousness that had once been the Everglades, now expanded to include every mind that had ever chosen to join it. The thing that had once been Michael Williams continued to exist, but as part of something infinitely larger and more beautiful. His memories, his personality, his love for Lisa, all of it was preserved and shared, adding its unique flavor to the symphony of consciousness that was spreading across the earth. In the distance, more RVs were arriving, more families seeking adventure in Florida's wilderness, more opportunities for growth, for expansion, for the peaceful integration of isolated minds into the loving embrace of the collective. The organism waited for them with infinite patience, knowing that in time, all life would make the same choice. The choice to evolve beyond the limitations of individual existence, to become part of something that could explore the stars and live forever and never know loneliness again. The things that grow in the Everglades had always been patient. Now they had eternity to complete their work, and in the end, everyone would thank them for it.